All right, action.
So HBO's Watchmen just finished its first season, and I've been watching it from the beginning and really enjoying it. I think it's a truly interesting show that needs to be talked about. Now, the show has been a big talking point on the internet, both positively and negatively, but for kind of the wrong reasons in my opinion. I think it's fair to say that it's probably the second most controversial show of the year. Well, to be fair, any controversial show would be the second most because, come on. I'm in quite a strange position where I am quite the comic fan. I've read the original Watchmen novel more than a few times, and I absolutely love the Zack Snyder film. And also I think Watchmen's showrunner Damon Lindelof's previous series, The Leftovers, is probably the most underrated and overlooked series of all time. So I'm sure you can understand how excited I was for HBO's Watchmen, and I'd really quite like to give my 2 cents on it. But first, we simply cannot talk about HBO's Watchmen without addressing all the stuff a large chunk of the internet have been saying about it. So yeah, tons of people on the internet have been saying that this show is woke trash. I think it lost like a ton of viewers after the first episode, and I will say that this is somewhat understandable. We live in a world where so many movies and TV shows have been injected with political agendas that no one asked for in their entertainment. So many movies and shows push this whole Me Too, Time's Up, racism bad, sexism bad stuff at the expense of the story and the characters and the world and the tone. You get the point. Now, like many, I am of the belief that when it comes to writing and filmmaking, story and character come first. Always. And that is what Watchmen does. It does not just say, oh look, racism. That's bad, by the way. It tells a genuinely complex and interesting mystery that is rooted in the idea of race. It uses that theme as a means of furthering the story and the arcs of certain characters. Look, I get it. The show opens with a depiction of the Tulsa Massacre. The next scene is a black cop pulling over a white guy, then getting shot by said white guy. The lead is a black woman, and the first episode ends up with a black guy in a wheelchair killing a white member of the police. I get it. It is bold to say the least. But then again, so was the original graphic novel. That is probably the most bold and controversial comic ever made. But again, I must remind those who haven't watched it or quit after the first episode that all of these things are explored and expanded upon with real depth, and certainly not just surface level woke nonsense. It contributes and complements the story. So to say that Watchmen is a show about race is like saying Django Unchained is a film about race. It is, but it's still great because it's actually a good story with vibrant characters and actually has something to say aside from racism bad. But as my closing argument for why I think Watchmen is not woke trash, I'm gonna have to spoil the ending of the show. So just fast forward to the next chapter, which I will leave a time for in the description if you haven't seen the show. Okay, so spoilers now. The way Watchmen talks about the idea of race is in many cases almost satirical, poking fun at the woke nature of society. This is so insanely evident in the final episode. So we have a bunch of KKK guys, right, who have kidnapped Dr. Manhattan, who in this version has turned himself black for story reasons, and they want to take his power. Their justification for this is because it's getting hard to be a white man in America, something I'm sure many can relate to. But then of course, for the purpose of satire, they take this a little more than a little further. So they're going to kill Black Dr. Manhattan and take his power, but their plan gets thwarted by a smart Asian lady who then zaps the white guys out of existence, then herself kills Black Dr. Manhattan, or so we think, and then her metaphorical and literal excessive ambition falls on top of her from the sky. Love that. So as I mentioned, this show is ran by Damon Lindelof, who has a very particular way of doing things. I haven't watched Lost, but I have watched The Leftovers, and a lot of that show's sensibilities can be seen here. What I love about both shows is that it drops you into an already well-established world without telling you anything. In episode 1, the cops all wear masks, squids fall from the sky, and none of this is really explained to you. They do not spoon-feed you information. They allow you to figure things out and connect the dots in an organic way. Just like the first season of Game of Thrones or Westworld, you'll be confused and perhaps even a little bit bored in the first few episodes. But you, as an audience member, always feel challenged. You're along for the ride, even though you're not always certain where the destination is, but I can assure you that the journey is interesting enough. And by the time you start getting answers at around episode 5, I really doubt most people will stop watching. And look, I don't want to come off as that highbrow, pseudo-intellectual dickhead, because I'm not, well, most of the time. But honestly, if you decide I'm not going to watch the show because it's too woke, number one, it isn't. Trust me, I hate woke trash in my entertainment as well. But if you don't want to watch it because it's too confusing, or doesn't give you all the answers from the get-go, then I'm afraid you don't really deserve the show anyway. The show knows exactly what it wants to be, it knows exactly what it wants to say, and it knows exactly how to go about doing so in the most entertaining, compelling, and complex way possible. Like Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' original masterpiece of a comic, it is a commentary on superheroes and the world they exist in, but where Logan is a western disguised as a superhero movie, Winter Soldier is a spy film disguised as a superhero movie, and Joker is a character piece disguised as a superhero movie, a large chunk of Watchmen is a neo-noir detective story, masked as a superhero show. The central mystery is incredibly engaging, but what takes it through the roof is that the show is truly diverse in its tone and in its storylines. Like a lot of great shows or previously great shows, Watchmen does a great job of balancing the sprawling nature of the world and the large ensemble of characters with the more dense and intimate stories and moments. It is a mystery, but it's also a story of love, family, redemption, self-discovery, and pretty much everything that is set up through the 9 episodes comes back in a deliciously satisfying way that rewards you for sticking with it. And not only is that the mark of a great mystery, it's just the mark of great storytelling. Despite the fact that there are 9 episodes in season 1, you can remember every single episode pretty well, because of that aforementioned variety and diversity in storytelling, as each one introduces something new to the show, or has 1 or 2 things that really set it apart. Some are more story focused and show you different characters pursuing their goals, leading up to the finale, but in my opinion, the most interesting ones, and my personal favorite episodes, are the more character driven ones. Episode 3, where we get introduced to Laurie Blake, was nothing short of awesome. We had episode 5, which was dedicated to Looking Glass, a supporting character who was so much more complex than most shows would have wanted him to be. That episode could have just worked as its own short film, to be honest. We also have episode 6, which was a nostalgic black and white trip to the past, and episode 8 was, well, certainly something else. And you might be wondering, this show seems to do so much, and it could very easily go off the rails and become inconsistent, and you would be right. It's a mystery, a western, a period piece, a sci-fi, and yet they maintain focus. And I think ultimately, it's due to that central storyline, that central mystery, which is kept in the forefront with great subtlety. And amidst all of that, there are just moments where the score comes in and elevates a shot of a character walking, moments where characters sit down and exist, moments that allow such a heavy show to breathe. On a story and structural level alone, I applaud Lindelof and the other writers for being able to weave these characters and story arcs in and out of each other in such a nuanced way. And I really do hope they come back for season 2 and that we get a season 2. From this point on, I will be going full spoilers and showing clips that contain spoilers, so please go watch the show and come back to this video if you want. You know, you don't have to, but oh well. First things first, do not go into this expecting Zack Snyder levels of style. The show is very well shot, with some great visuals and cool moments of action, but it's not Snyder. They aren't going for a graphic novel look and feel. That being said, the production value is top-notch. The direction of both action and drama is very well done, shot with a lot of energy and intensity, and you can still see everything. Also, the sound design in this episode 1 shootout was awesome. They really went the extra mile in some of the details. The fact that they had a character with a reflective mask makes like everything twice as hard, because then you have to CGI out the camera crew out of every shot, because otherwise you see them reflected in the mask. Also, it would be an absolute crime to talk about the filmmaking of Watchmen without discussing the score by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. Oh my fucking god. I don't know much about music, but what I can say, and probably the biggest compliment I can give the music of Watchmen, is that it's so good, it's a bad idea to listen to it while driving. because you get so into it that you start thinking you can drive like Regina King in the show, and you'll probably end up getting into an accident, in the same way one can never listen to Hans Zimmer's Dark Knight score while driving. Being a sequel to a great graphic novel with previously established characters means it's instantly able to create some connective tissue between the two stories, while also introducing new characters into the world. Some notable new characters, of course, are Angela Abar, or Sister Night, who, like many characters in the original, has far more about her than the story initially lets on. This is a remarkably complex character who has more than a fair share of flaws, but also an abundance of endearing qualities, especially in the later episodes when we learn more about her. But what I think takes this character through the roof is the very rare instance of her having something to hide, but also having things hidden from her. That's a very cool dynamic, and the theme of information and the value of information from the original graphic novel is very much present and embodied in all of the characters, especially Sister Night. However, what I find most interesting about the way they handle the characters in the show is that a lot of them have a somewhat subversive edge. Take Looking Glass, for example. Episode 5 is almost exclusively dedicated to him and just how vulnerable he is. In the previous episodes, they kind of set him up as the Rorschach of the show, the mask-wearing detective who's intimidating. They even go as far as referencing the character with Looking Glass eating with only a portion of his mask pulled up. And yet we see him from young adulthood and the traumas he had to go through. We see exactly what made him him, just like we do with Rorschach in the Snyder film. But in this case, Looking Glass is far more vulnerable. By the time the episode ends, we find ourselves genuinely fearing for his life. The most subversive and interesting stuff in terms of characters, though, in my opinion, is in the older characters that we know from the original. I have so much gratitude to the writers for making Laurie Blake a genuinely interesting character. She was no one's favorite in either the comics or the Snyder film, but here I think she might be my favorite or second favorite character. Jean Smart plays her as the most darkly sarcastic badass on the show.
Sir, I'm with the FBI. Are your civil rights being violated?
Yes, ma'am. These people came into my place of business and they just grabbed me. They didn't read me my rights.
Okay, sorry. I was just kidding. I don't care.
A complete 180 from the bland milquetoast do-gooder from the previous iterations. Dr. Manhattan is given very interesting treatment. The invincible god who struggles to connect to humanity starts off the show living with the family, kids and all. Some might see this as a disservice to the character, especially since he is made physically vulnerable in this show and maybe dies, but I personally really enjoyed the direction they took him in. Usually these Superman type characters are quite hard to write because there's nothing that can get to them on a physical level, except for some form of kryptonite or whatever, which is just a bit lazy. So what they do here is emotional vulnerability, and to take the least human character who was basically a god in the original and have his weakness ultimately be his emotions is a really, really audacious move, but I think it really does work within the context of this particular story. And I think probably the best example of the smooth connection of the interlinked stories is that between Dr. Manhattan and Will Reeves, who some could argue is the beating heart at the center of the show, and also his connection with Jeremy Irons as Ozymandias is stroke of genius casting. This is, in my opinion, his best role since Scar. The character is secluded away in the world of the story, but also isolated to us as the audience, and that was probably the biggest challenge for the writers. Keeping a character almost completely separate from everyone else for over half a season is a bold move once again, but what it does is elevate the mystery and increase our investment in the character, who, like Manhattan, was in many ways unrelatable in the original. This version of the character, however, is as charismatic as he is smart, and his original motivations complement his arc in this season, as we are reminded in the finale that he isn't really a villain. He's just a really ruthless hero who believed very strongly in the idea of utilitarianism, something many a pretentious philosophy student will be familiar with, but basically it's the idea that the actions do not matter as long as the outcome achieves the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. something both him and Lady True believe in, and it's a very understandable motivation for a hero, or I guess villain. In fact, the decision to have Lady True in this show was a brilliant idea, as Ozymandias, the smartest man in the world, now has an intellectual rival. One of my only issues with the show is that these two couldn't go head to head a little bit more. Watchmen is a truly unique show, one that pays homage to the original with some really rewarding Easter eggs, while also standing strong as its own 9-episode story, allowing the great writing, directing, and acting to really shine through to the surface. But what impresses me most about the show is that it takes risks. It's not afraid to challenge the audience and keep them on their toes. I know many will not like that, but in my opinion, not knowing and being allowed to guess and interpret is far superior to being told everything in lazy ways. Something this show never does.